Of course, no programme on Tommy Makem would be complete which did not emphasise his extraordinary debt to his mother, Sarah Makem. On last week's programme, he did make that point.
She would have been regarded as not only a singer, but a source singer.
And he recalled last week his boyhood memory of a BBC invasion, a radio recording crew.
The BBC people coming in the early 1950s, coming to the house and staying there for a couple of weeks, recording songs by my mother. They'd be there every night, and there'd be all kinds of musicians and lilters and things from the district. And mostly they got hundreds of songs from my mother.
But last week we did not then include Sarah Makem's voice, so here it is. This from Harry Bradshaw's documentary on Peter Kennedy, the noted song collector who was working on that BBC radio programme As I Roved Out with Sean O'Boyle. And indeed it was Sarah Makem's voice which sang the signature tune of that programme, which helped to put folk music on the map in these islands. Peter Kennedy.
Seamus Ennis and myself were appointed as full-time collectors. And one of the first trips I did was in fact to Northern Ireland. And after our first couple of years, we realised that there was an opportunity of doing a regular radio programme. And I suggested that the title, As I Roved Out, and I said I had this little piece of recording from Sarah Makem in Cady in County Armagh, and so that's how we began. We got the title and the signature tune.
This is the BBC live programme.
As I roved out on a May morning, and a May morning right early, I met my love upon the way, oh Lord, but she was early.
The reason for choosing As I Roved Out was, of course, we never asked people about folk songs, because people didn't know in those days anything about folk music or used that term at all. We talked about old songs, but the best way of getting somebody to sing an old song of the type we wanted was to say, do you know any songs that begin As I Walked Out, or As I Roved Out, or Come All Ye, or whatever? Because if you say these opening words, people instinctively follow it up, it comes out something they haven't thought about for 50 years or more. They come out with that song. So that was how I came to Sarah Makem in Cady, along with Sean O'Boyle to help me, and her kitchen was the place where people gathered, and Sarah herself, as she went around the house, would sing little bits of songs, and that's was those recordings that we first made in County Armagh that inspired us, I think, very much to start this weekly programme. It was every Sunday morning, 10 o'clock till 10:30, when people should be at church. The broadcasts of As I Roved Out went on the air, and that went on, well, off and on for about 15 years, with Seamus and myself presenting them.
This next point cannot be exaggerated enough. And indeed, regular listeners to RTÉ Radio at this time on a Sunday morning don't need it emphasised, because Ciarán Mac Mahuna made it explicitly and implicitly so often. That it was the recording, the capturing of those songs on tape half a century ago, while they were still part of an oral tradition handed down over the centuries, which gives us a link 2 centuries past. Here's the point, emphasised briefly by another distinguished collector and broadcaster, Seamus Ennis.
In Connemara, I found that the richest fund of folk music of all is still there. And I found the singing to be almost medieval in its flavour, completely unaffected by modern convention. The rhythm of the tune was dictated only by the metre and text of the lyric, and sometimes the melodic line with its elaborate ornamentation absolutely baffled definition.
Seamus Ennis. Armagh was another important song centre. Peter Kennedy was among a number of important collectors who helped preserve Sarah Makem's song collection, a collection which she had remembered casually from a lifetime of interest in the songs of her neighbourhood. In this documentary by Harry Bradshaw, part of the Long Note series, Peter Kennedy talked about that first pioneering trip over half a century ago in which he first made her acquaintance. He was accompanied by Sean O'Boyle.
When we first met, Sean O'Boyle and myself, because we each thought we were going to have long beards and be professorish sort of people, and we were quite pleased to discover that we weren't either of us like that. And the very first evening that after we met, we went to his father's house in Belfast, Charles Boyle, who had worked with Hennebery, and that had been, of course, how Sean O'Boyle himself had become interested in folk music, very much through his father, and working with Carl Hardybeck in Cork at the School of Music. And so our first call was to his house, and it was into that house came Frank McPeak, not only playing the Uilleann pipes, but singing with the Uilleann pipes. Now this to me was absolutely incredible, because I had been only just a few months before, recording bagpipers in Yugoslavia singing with bagpipes. Again, bellows-blown pipes, you see.
This is a digression, but it's worth hearing. Worth noting how open-minded Peter Kennedy was to all styles and idiosyncrasies. And he was not afraid to tell his BBC bosses in Belfast that they might be more open-minded too.
Then to come to Ireland and discover this wonderful old man, Frank McPeak, singing with the pipes. And I was very excited, and the next morning when I made my report to BBC in Belfast, I went in, there was a man called Frank Curry who was the head of music. I said, do you know about these McPeaks? They're only a few yards, as it were, away from the BBC. Do you know about this music and singing with the pipes? And I was rather sat upon and told that singing with the pipes was not an Irish tradition, that had never historically, they'd never known of such a case, and that this man was very much an exception, and all kinds of things about intonation, which was a word in those days I didn't know what it meant, but the point was that I made some recordings of the McPeaks in a cupboard in their own house, not only singing with the bagpipes but singing in seconds as well. Eventually persuaded HMV to issue that record, and it was the first sort of post-war folk music revival record, and that was Frank and Francis McPeak singing "Will You Go, Lassie, Go."
Yes, summertime is coming, and the trees are sweetly blooming, and the wild mountain thyme grows around the blooming heather. Will you go, lassie, go? And we'll all go together to Paul Wild Mountain time, all around the blooming heather. Will you go, lassie?
Well, that very first evening in Charles Boyle's house in Belfast, Frank McPeak came in, and of course the other singers who came sort of dropped in during the evening, in fact. But one I remember in particular was John McClaverty, who had a great store of Belfast street songs like the Hot Ash Pelt and the type of songs that were important, because although they weren't the older ones, they were a kind of link with the music halls.
They then made Sean O'Boyle's house in Armagh as their temporary headquarters.
And started sort of systematically working from Armagh as a centre. And we used to come back with tapes, very tired and exhausted, and Sean's wife would give us a cup of tea. And then the next morning the milkman used to come in, and the milkman came from Cady. And he kept on saying to us, well, now, the person you want to go to, the person you want to visit is Sarah Makem in Cady, because her house, everybody gathers at Sarah Makem. So eventually we found ourselves going to her house there, and it was perfectly true. She was a wonderful person. She made us so welcome. She always says, "You're welcome as the flowers of May." I remember that lovely expression. But the only way she herself could be recorded was by moving the microphone around, following around the kitchen, because she couldn't stop and sing a song. She had to be doing something and moving around. So that was how she came to be recorded.
As he went walking up the streets of Derry, I'm sure he marched upright manfully. He was more like a commanding officer than a to die on the gallows tree. The very first step he went up the ladder, his blooming colours began to fill with heavy sighs and with dismal cries. Is there no releasement from Derry jail? The very next step he went up the ladder, his aged father was standing by. Come here, my old aged father, and speak one word to me before I die.
We worked from Armagh all the time, but we went to the other counties. In County Antrim, there were some very good fiddle players and singers, and in County Tyrone, for instance, I remember that we were recording a lot of songs about Pochine, and on one occasion we were actually offered some right up on the mountains of Pomeroy, and so we decided that we should accept, having recorded all these songs about Pochine, both Sean and I accept, with rather disastrous results afterwards, I remember, because although one felt superhuman for quite a while, when it wore off, you got very depressed, and then when you had a cup of tea again, you were off again. It was an extraordinary experience.
And Tommy Makem himself reflects on the rich heritage of the musical tradition of his native place. This is from his interview with John Skehan in his Words and Music series, in which the interviewee was invited to select some favourite music.
In the north of Ireland, you have sort of three strands of folk song, all mixed into one. You'll have the Irish tradition, you have an English tradition, and you'll have a very close Scottish tradition. As a matter of fact, some of my best friends, a couple that I admire very much, are a couple called the Corries. They were originally 4, but they were down to 2. And they're singing, as a matter of fact, a Northern Ireland song that was written by the poet Joseph Campbell. A lot of people don't know that. He also wrote My Lagan Love, and he wrote the famous, or at least a version of the famous Dublin one, as I wrote it, The Spanish Lady, Joseph Campbell. But a beautiful song that is now on the rise, being recorded by some American folk singers, the Garton Mother's Lullaby. But I'm very fond of the Corries recording of it. They did a lovely job on it.
Dusk is drawn, and the green man's thorn is wreathed in rings of fog. Shivra sails his boat till dawn among the starry bog. Elian van On, my child, my joy, my love and heart's desire. The cricket sings his lullaby beside the dying fire.
So back to young Tommy Makem in New York, migrating there to find his fortune, working first, as we've heard, in the weaving industry in Dover in New Hampshire. But an accident there to his arm accelerated what was probably an inevitable move to New York, and acting and singing. Here he is from an interview with Mike Murphy talking about life in New York in the early 1960s. 6 or 7 years after he had arrived in North America, he was about 30.
We used to go to a pub in the village called the White Horse Tavern.
The village, of course, is Greenwich Village in Lower Manhattan, New York City.
And there was always a great bit of singing, and they didn't allow singing. was an old German man owned the bar, and they'd be singing in the back room, you see. Everybody would gather there, and there'd be a great sing-song in the back room. And old Ernie would come in and he'd say, "No singing allowed here." So everybody would stop until Ernie got out and got back behind the bar again, and then the singing would start. So he'd let you go for another hour, and then he'd come in an hour later and tell you no singing. And one afternoon, people like Theo Bickel used to be in, for instance.
Yes, the actor.
Kingston Trio and...
the Kingston Trio. Of course, they were great contemporaries of yours.
Oh, sure,
yes,
yeah.
That's right.
Oh, yeah.
And you knew them well, did
Oh,
you?
Mads Hatters, the whole bunch of them.
Were they?
I tell you stories about them now. Theo Bickel was in one evening, and we had been singing sea shanties and all kinds of stuff, and somebody produced a guitar and gave it to Theo and asked him to sing a song. So Theo got the guitar tuned up and he started to sing a song, and Ernie sent in one of the barmen to tell him, "No singing in here." So he came in, and instead of saying "no singing in here," Theo was playing the guitar to get started his song, and he looked at him and says, "Hey, you can't play that thing," and walked out again. And Theo says, "I wouldn't mind if he had said that I wasn't allowed to play."
You can't play it.
And there was an old lady lived upstairs, and she used to kick up a terrible row about all this singing going on, and she would send the police, but we knew all the police in the precinct.
Yeah.
So the police would come in and say, "Are you guys singing again? Where's the party tonight?" You see? So she kicked up terrible rows, but one night we were on the Ed Sullivan Show, one Sunday night, and the following day, Monday, we were back down in the White Horse, and the old lady from upstairs came down, and she says, "Were you guys on TV last night?" I said, "We were." She said, "Well, that's all right. You can keep singing away as much as you want." She had seen the Sullivan Show, so the singing didn't bother her anymore after that.
Mike Murphy asked Tommy Makem about the folk song scene in New York at that time.
There were great things being done. Lots of writers and singers and actors, and it was the hub of all the sort of artistic endeavours.
Yeah. Did you meet Bob Dylan at that stage?
Oh, yes, very much so.
He was around there at that stage.
He was. There used to be Liam Clancy and I were in a play at one point off Broadway. It had been running for a while, and there were a couple of guys starting a folk club in a place called Gerdy's, and they came and asked us to go and sing in this folk club, and we didn't know anything about it, but we were getting like $40 a week, $45 a week off Broadway for this play, and these fellas offered us $125 each a week to go down and sing a few songs every night.
Yeah. The two of you.
Oh yeah,
you
two
and
of
me,
us, yeah. So we broke their arms to take the money.
Yeah.
And of course you had all day to go and look for another acting job.
Yeah.
So we went down there, and this young fella used to come. He would be playing around the little coffee houses around, and he would come in and listen to our songs.
And years later, Bob Dylan recalled the impact being made then by the Clancy brothers and Tommy Makem.
They just reached a lot of people, with their exuberance and their attitude. They were all so different. You were around them all the time, and they just sang so many songs all the time.
And Tommy Makem recalled the young Dylan.
You'd maybe meet him on the street at, maybe 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. You'd be coming home from playing in the place, and you meet him on the street, and he would stop you in the middle of 6th Avenue and say, I wrote a song to that, so he'd start and he'd sing you like 43 verses of a song that he had written to some tune of a song that you were already doing.